Michael. I also want to, got it. I just also wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm being beamed to you from, the Whadjuk Noongar people. And I also wanted to thank Pia and echo Michael's sentiment about the productive relationship. Thank you for the opportunity to present. Thank you for supporting the survey, the Plan My Australia Expert Survey, and thank you for the award too, so much appreciated. So what I'll be presenting today is recent research which has been published in a stream of journal papers that no one's likely read, but which will be published in an upcoming book, which is going to be called Business's Unusual Visions for Future Australian Cities. I'd like to acknowledge the many contributors to this research: Nicole Edwards, Paula Hooper, Robert Freestone, Robert Cameron, David Nichols, Nur Roslin, have all contributed in their way, and frankly, it wouldn't have happened without them in this form. So the presentation is going to be in 5 sections. This is the first time I presented it, so this could be a little bit of a wild ride. Let's see how we go. The first section really is just making the case the current Australian dream in its 20th century suburban form, fired by fossil fuels, and population growth is running out of steam. I will table 8 visions for future Australian cities. We will then consider and test and run the visions, these different scenarios, we have run them through a couple of surveys, one of experts, one of lay people, to understand the degree to which they resonate with the Australian people. We will then test the 8 scenarios, which, by the way, you can see in the background here, through a continental mapping exercise to understand the degree to which they align with where the conditions tell us we should be developing. And finally, I'll make the case for going national, which is the need for a national urban policy. So that is the shape of things to come. So firstly, to the dream and it running out of steam. So demographic predictions are a notoriously tricky area with enough variables to make fools of many. That all acknowledged, the mid-level population projection from the ABS for this century is that Australia's population will roughly double to 53 million by 2100. It's really difficult to conceptualize these timeframes and numbers. But however, given current life expectancy, many children born today will actually see 2100, hopefully one of whom will be my daughter. So it's real and it's happening. I think one of the big issues in Australia is that population growth is often cast in negative terms and is sort of at best regarded as a problem to be solved. Contrary to this view, we feel that population growth represents a creative opportunity. And it should be said, it's actually a huge creative opportunity. When we look at what, in city terms, how many cities we would need to build to accommodate this additional population, which will surge to 53 million, we're talking here 115 Canberras, which is, if you're into Canberra or not, that you could consider that a bit of a scary prospect, 24 Perths, 20 Brisbanes, 10 Melbournes, or 9 Sydneys. So essentially, we're building a bit over a Sydney every decade to 2100. So this is a huge exercise, which we're in the midst of, and which I think for the people listening you're on the coalface of this day in, day out. But when you zoom out, this is what we're collectively really doing. However, what is missing here from the ABS projections of this neat 53 million target or projection is an allowance for climate-generated migration. I believe this isn't an omission, given the International Organization for Migration believe the greatest single impact of climate change could be on human migration. Indeed, it is projected there'll be a deluge of climate change refugees by mid-century, many emanating from Asia, which is regarded as ground zero for climate change impacts. The projections, no doubt, are wrong, but they vary from anywhere between 100 million to 1 billion climate change refugees by mid-century. When I say they're wrong, it's because, well, what is a climate change refugee anyway? Is it someone who's displaced within a country, someone who crosses a border? Is it someone who's displaced by a war or a revolution which was fueled by climate change? So the figures are debated, but they pose a big question in relation to Australia's role in accommodating this projected surge of refugees. And of course, the case for increasing Australia's humanitarian migration intake has a moral dimension, given our bloated greenhouse gas emission, but it also has a pragmatic component. As Bernard Salt, asks, in the face of a potential deluge of refugees, what does Australia do? Board and turn back every boat? Leave the refugees without support on the Kimberley coast? Plan to help as many as we can and hope we can ship back tens of thousands of people? Evidently, this poses huge questions. Concerningly, despite the considerable contributions of migrants to Australian society, some Australians regard population growth through immigration in particular as a problem. Fairly recent credible polling shows that 64% of Australians regard immigration levels over the last decade as too high. Other surveys reveal that over 2/3 of respondents do not feel like Australia needs more people. And such opinions flow to some degree from long-standing immigration destinations. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the majority of new arrivals settled in Melbourne or Sydney. As a result, the population of these cities was surging by over 100,000 people annually. And residents felt related impacts in escalating housing costs, infrastructure deficits, and traffic congestion. However, it's really important to note that these were also the result of some policy failures and misguided policies such as negative gearing. But the question remains, is there actually heaps of room, as this poster would indicate, or as the bumper stickers might tell us, are we full? And what does that even mean? The debate, this really goes to debates around Australia's carrying capacity, and these debates are polarised and hysterical often. The gloomy Professor Paul Ehrlich, who's a biologist, predicts what is crystal clear is Australia should have a shrinking population. Australia is already in deep trouble, way beyond its carrying capacity. And I'm afraid we're not going to see 40 or 100 million Australians. We're likely to see fewer than 20 million, and many may have to evacuate, Professor Paul Ehrlich. On the other hand, we have people like Harry High-Rise Triggerboff, developer from Sydney, has proclaimed, I'd like to see 100 million because I believe we will have many things to do here besides drilling holes and selling coal. Our agriculture has to be huge. Our desalination must be fantastic. Our rivers must flow the right way. It will all have to be developed. So this is this old idea that comes through from at least the early 20th century, that we can re-engineer Australia's ecologies to finally tame and claim its arid centre and properly develop it once and for all. Somewhere in the middle, Sorry concluded, there is enough water, land, food and energy to provide a moderate lifestyle for 50 million people. They said that in 2002. I'm not quite sure they don't define what they mean by a moderate lifestyle, but I'm pretty sure we're not living in them. I know I'm definitely not, certainly by global standards. Other people have had a go at this contested issue of estimating carrying capacity, but through geospatial mapping. This is researcher Murray Lane. So he mapped carrying capacity using parameters such as available food, energy, fibre, and environmental protection mechanisms in conjunction with energy and food consumption. So while in some respects, global supply chains have meant that estimations of carrying capacity based on arbitrary land boundaries are hypothetical, some estimations nonetheless give us a guide to the degree to which a region can sustain its human population if needed. And what this map here shows the percentage to which a particular region has been over-exceeded in terms of its carrying capacity. So he identifies that, for instance, there is some capacity, or we haven't completely over-exceeded areas like this in the wheat belt and central sort of New South Wales, but in the interior and in the north, and indeed in the populous sort of East Coast mega region between Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, his estimation is that we've already significantly exceeded the carrying capacity, which is that if we stopped importing food and the like, then we would have significant problems in terms of supporting those populations. So make of that what you will. But I think one thing we would all agree on is that climate change is likely to reduce carrying capacity. This map here from Climate Change Australia shows under an RCP 8.5, which is a fairly high climate change projection by 2090, that places like Karratha, their average max daily temperature will be some over 5 degrees hotter than it currently is now. So what will happen there is we get also decreasing rainfall, particularly in the southwest and southeast, and increasing evapotranspiration, all of which will have a drastic effect on the carrying capacity of those regions. So beyond issues of carrying capacity, there are other valid reasons why many view population growth as a problem. I mean, for instance, several Australian cities are sprawling into biodiversity hotspots. Here I'm talking about Perth, Sydney and Brisbane. And these biodiversity hotspots are regarded as the life support systems of the planet. If we go to our little corner of the world, and I'm speaking to people here in Perth, we've 93% cleared the vegetation of the Southwest Australia biodiversity hotspot, and some clearing of the remaining 7% continues. As a result of that, we have now more than 2,500 threatened plants just in our little biodiversity hotspot, which is more than most other Australian states and countries of the world. This is how it looks around Perth. I should say the broader clearing of the hotspot is mostly due to agriculture, but the Perth area of the Swan Coastal Plain was particularly biodiverse. It was a hotspot within the hotspot. There's species here which exist nowhere else on Earth, and they cannot be offset. And you'd have to say, looking at these maps of the endemic plant associations in 1829, and now that we have done a fairly thorough job. And part of the issue of that has been the fact that we've developed at a typically low density. And when we look at the population projection of 6.6 million for Perth from the ABS for 2061, if we do continue to deliver development at a density which is sort of typical to Perth's existing form, then the city could sprawl by another 1,486 square kilometres. Now, of course, it won't. That will be wrong. Things will happen. Policies will change. But nonetheless, it gives us some estimation, some gauge of what a future Perth could look like. Perth or Girth, as some people have called it, and how we handle this and how we reconcile this with the biodiversity that remains is, I think, one of the defining challenges of this period for us. And it won't be just about biodiversity, it'll also be about how we manage societal stratification, how we deliver jobs to these outer suburbs, which are meaningful and well-paying, how we service it with public transport. All of these are major problems, which I know are being wrestled with. But given the level of emotion around population growth and polarizing issues such as environmental destruction, outstripping carrying capacity and immigration, it's no wonder many politicians give population planning a wide berth. A cautionary tale was Kevin Rudd in 2009, who went on record saying he believed in a big Australia of 36 million people by mid-century, which landed him in hot water. His successor, Gillard, was a bit more sensible and wound the rhetoric back and said she believed in a sustainable Australia and didn't put a number on it. Subsequently, population growth through immigration has become highly politicised. Indeed, successive governments have used the claim of stopping the boats to boost electoral fortunes. And we can see Scott Morrison's little prize statue on his desk saying, "I stopped these." And, the example of on the day of the recent federal election, Scott Morrison instructing the Australian Border Force to publicise an interception of a suspected asylum seeker boat, presumably to boost votes. The pandemic didn't help too, as population growth and population density in the early days of the pandemic became regarded as creating the conditions optimal for COVID transmission. Moreover, increasing urban densification to accommodate surging populations is sometimes regarded as a threat to the quintessential suburban life. So to this question, are we full? Well, definitely some communities feel like they're full. Not all, but some. As Wendy Sarkissian tells us, a huge battle has been waging for more than 2 decades about this matter in Australia, and a public sullenness exists around urban infill and suburban neighbourhoods. Our research indicates otherwise, but you would have to indicate, or you would have to be honest to say there has been a stream of research conducted which identifies community resistance to densification as being endemic. Some people call them NIMBYs, some people call them bananas, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. Okay, so where does this leave us? I mean, I realize this is relentlessly cynical, but I'll let it run to its natural conclusion. For reasons of environmental overshoot, runaway climate change, sometimes xenophobia and community angst, you would have to argue that the 20th century suburban dream, which is fueled by fossil fuels and booming populations, is running out of steam, particularly in the capital cities. We have problems with protecting biodiversity and reconciling biodiversity with our cities. Bushfires are increasingly becoming a threat to cities. Housing affordability is declining. Climate change, we're bracing for the impact and feeling the impact of climate change. So there's many things here which are working against the traditional Australian dream. And I apologise for my relentless negativity, but I do it because I want to consider what could be some alternative dreams. And you need to watch out for people like me who manufacture crises so that they can push particular visions. I realize there is a history of people doing that. Okay, so let's flick into a more positive mode. I will now take you on a tour of 8 different continental scale scenarios for population distribution. And I'm going to say up front that a couple of these are pretty ridiculous, given the challenges we just considered. But they exist to some degree in the form of historical proposals, contemporary policy, or even just linger in the collective psyche of Australians. So we've unearthed them and put them on maps. They're quite one-dimensional, but that's deliberate because they're more of a tool for thinking than a prescription for action. Any real plan would need to be a mongrel of a few of these. I've divided them into 3 broad types. The first I'm calling conquering capitals, the second decentralisation dreams, and the third frontier fever. Conquering capitals, this scenario is based on the existing capitals. Decentralisation dreams are proposals which decentralise population from the capitals. And frontier fever is where we tackle these areas which are currently really haven't experienced much urbanisation. And yes, I do like alliteration. Just to set the figures in place and to do the maths, they accommodate an additional 14 million people, which is half of the 28 million people increase projected by the ABS for 2100. So we're presuming the other 14 million dispersed organically. And yes, I realize there are major presumptions going on here. So let's dive into the conquering capitals. The first of the conquering capital scenarios is the boosted secondary cities. It's predicated on the notion that population growth in the larger state capitals, Melbourne and Sydney, is on the nose, and they've become congested and exorbitantly expensive. The boosted secondary capital city responded to this reality by distributing population growth to the remaining 6 state and territory capitals, projecting population increases by over 2 million people each by 2100. So this scenario was informed by the Morrison government's direction to ease population growth pressures, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. And looking at a aerial photo of the suburban paradise of Adelaide's sprawling suburbs, you'd have to concede there is some capacity. And there is some planning. The good thing about this scenario is that the secondary capitals already have planning in place to accommodate measured increases in population, principally through increased in continuing suburban sprawl, albeit in a denser form, but also in transit-orientated development. So this is a kind of default response, which is evident in the current planning. And there are particular wonderful opportunities like the parkland, which encircles Adelaide CBD. It's 9 times bigger than Central Park in Manhattan. And it's a wonderful diagram onto which we could graph substantial density in urban populations. Okay, the second conquering capital scenario is megacities. And I thank Nur Rosalind for her wonderful imagery here. The megacity scenario argues that Melbourne and Sydney, Australia's 2 biggest cities, generate most of Australia's GDP and attract most migrants. So rather than fighting against the flow, why don't we just run with it? The megacity scenario extrapolated the situation and hypothesized by the 2100. Melbourne and Sydney could increase by almost 7 million people each and becoming megacities, which are cities of over 10 million people. This might sound completely ridiculous, but it's not actually that far off what is being planned for by respective state governments. So here we would, for the first time, deliver an Australian megacity or 2. Now, megacities tend to rate pretty terribly in global livability rankings. Los Angeles, pictured here, according to The Economist, ranked about 44th. They tend to grind people down. They're a bit of a hassle. They're very expensive, but they are kind of sublime and fascinating places to visit. And if you don't like them, well, you could always choose other Australian cities which haven't reached megacity status. So this is one potential. We could actually consolidate growth in Melbourne and Sydney. But stretching out from Australia's fixation on the capitals, we'll now explore some different dreams in terms of population decentralisation. So in response to the congestion and affordability challenges in the state capitals, the satellite city scenario resorts to an enduring planning model of metropolitan population redistribution to satellite cities orbiting the state capitals. So in the diagram here, there are 14 satellite cities within commuting distance to the state capitals, which would increase by over 1 million people each by 2100. This also broadly aligns with the previous federal government's planning for population migration and better cities, which designated several satellite centres for growth. The concept of satellite cities emerges out of the Garden City movement, which Ebenezer Howard proposed the siphoning of populations away from chronically congested and polluted central cities into smaller garden cities connected by rail networks. To prevent the city sprawling into a kind of vast conurbation, Howard proposed encircling green belts comprised of natural areas and farms, dotted with insane asylums and homes for inebriates and waifs. Putting the population decentralisation on course of steroids, this next scenario proposed efficient and high-speed fast rail links along the east and west coast, along which you would dot regional cities to take the pressure off major existing capitals. The projected population of these regional cities was boosted by over 750,000 in each of these centres to deliver our overall population increase of 14 million by 2100. The scenario derived from a previous developed analysis in 2013 with Richard Weller and a former federal government proposal for high-speed rail. It also builds upon the Albanese government's proposed high-speed rail from Sydney to Melbourne. So here we go, the 25 cities of 750,000. And none of these cities, given contemporary speeds of high-speed rail, would be more than 2.5 hours from a capital city. So you potentially open up affordable land and natural amenity with some connectivity via the NBN and fast rail back to the capitals. And there's an opportunity here to really think about creating a mega region of new cities, which is a fabulous sort of creative opportunity. And this is the potential new cities of the East Coast line between Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, and Melbourne. And an image here of somewhere, if you've got a holiday house up at Cervantes, maybe hang on to it. This could be a big development come 2100 here, less than half an hour from Geraldton and less than half an hour from Perth on a West Coast high-speed rail link. Okay. So the next scenario, and I realise there's a lot, I'll keep moving, is predicated on the idea that Australians continue to prize coastal amenity. And the Gold Coast for many years has been the Australians' fastest growing city. So what about a sea change scenario that doesn't bother fighting Australians' sort of love and coast hugging sensibility? This was the idea here of selecting 25 alternative sea change cities and increasing the population of these by over 500,000 people each by 2100. One example could be Bernard Salt's proposal for Broome, which he called Boom Boom Broome in the northwest of WA to become a Gold Coast of the West. And as he called it, a weekender for Chinese wealthy elite. This was in 2010. Given it's already primed with an international airport and stunning beaches, stranger things have happened. Although the town hall meetings with the locals could get interesting. To the final type of scenarios was frontier cities. These scenarios aim to increase populations within what Patrick White called the Great Australian Emptiness of the West, the North, and the Centre. The first of these scenarios is the inland city scenario. It was inspired by late 19th to early 20th century period in which Australians endeavoured to create a rural civilization which spread out across the interior despite the harsh reality of the red centre's environment. Moreover, it is predicated on the assessment that Australia has an array of inland centres with at least hypothetical growth capacity. To achieve our target of accommodating an additional 14 million people, this scenario distributes population growth to a horde of inland centres, boosted by over 500,000 people each by 2100. It emerges from a wellspring of 20th century proposals, which aim to finally claim and tame the centre. One of the most dramatic was a 1944 plan for a vast 11,000 kilometre continental scale railway, which was to open up Central Australia for development. You can see that on the right. Its proponents believe that many of tens of thousands of men who built the railway would remain as permanent residents of the cities along the vast rail network. You might not be surprised to hear that Alfred Griffiths, who proposed the scheme, was the director of a company that built trains and railway sleepers, and as such had some vested interest in proposing an 11,000 kilometre long railway, which to my calculation would have required 22 million sleepers. Other frankly insane schemes were to re-engineer Australia with vast infrastructural projects. The zenith of such thinking was proposals to gouge canals from Spencer Gulf to the interior to flood Central Australia and build the inland sea that we never found, around which would be new cities and vast agriculture. As the proponent Ian Idris proclaimed in the 1940s, Australia's city of the future will not be found in 5 or 6 spots along our 12,000-mile coastline. They will stretch continuously along the rivers of the plains, from Roma to the Murray Mouth, from the Hughenden to Lake Eyre. On the fertile plains around Lake Eyre will grow a garden city. Idris allegedly liked to drink, which might explain some of these proposals. However, such ideas were a creature of the time, emerging at the tail end of World War II as a way of keeping armies employed. Essentially, now the boys weren't fighting the Japanese, they could go to work fighting the landscape, using much of the same spirit and machinery. While such outlandish schemes are being consigned to the dustbins of history, the desire for the development of the interior surfaces occasionally. In this instance, partly in the Supertowns project under the Carpenter West Australian State Government, which proposed the boosting of some non-coastal West Australian centres such as Tanning, Collie, Northam and Moora. In the second last scenario is entitled Western Cities. So currently WA comprises 33% of Australia's landmass, but accommodates only 11% of its population. An imbalance this scenario aims to address. So much like the USA, this scenario proposes a brash and youthful network of West Coast cities to counterbalance the East Coast establishment. In numeric terms, the scenario proposed boosting cities and towns along the West Coast by over 1.5 million people each by 2100. While the scale of the numbers is vastly different, it builds upon the current WA Royalties for Regions program and planning for the state's capital city, Perth. The Royalties for Regions program has invested billions of dollars in the Pilbara to develop jerry-built FIFO swaggering mining towns in WA's Pilbara region into bustling cities of the north with all the cultural amenity and good quality coffee of the southern capitals. And we can see that here in Karratha. Other proposals for Western cities that have emerged are more aspirational. Constitutional lawyer Benjamin Gusson has proposed a mini Dubai or Hong Kong in the Kimberley, which would exploit synergies between Singapore and Australia. Singapore coughing up the money for infrastructure and Australia the land. The city would operate under its own constitution as a charter city. As Gusson enthuses, over time, the number of construction cranes and Dilga's skyline makes even cities like Dubai look flaccid. Okay, and our final scenario is entitled Northern Cities. Northern Australia has a small population despite its substantial economic might and proximity to Asia. Moreover, proponents of northern development cite the emerging food bowl of the Ord River irrigation area and the colossal Lake Argyle as evidence of its potential to support a vastly increased population. In response, this scenario boosts 9 northern cities by over 1.5 million people each, which actually relates to current planning for substantial population growth in Northern Australia in the white paper for developing Northern Australia, which was proposed by the previous Morrison federal government. This document proposed a rapid 4-fold increase in the population in Northern Australia from 1.3 million to 5 million by 2060. This substantial urban expansion, evident or suggested in policy to house this additional populations, is the equivalent to 22 new Townsvilles or 36 new Darwins or 253 new Brooms, all hypothetically within the next 40 years or so. The white paper itself ambiguously refers to the development of major population centres of more than 1 million people. However, it does not illustrate what forms they could take. There are, however, a number of interesting new city proposals in the north, which could provide some clues. Such proposals include one for a Jewish city by the Free Land League for Jewish Territorial Colonisation in the early 20th century. And as Dr. Nathan Steinberg exhorted at the time, what could not Jewish colonists achieve here? Only 3 things must be brought on a large scale if the Kimberleys are to flower in wealth and glory: men, money, and inspiration. This Jewish city of the north could have changed world history and certainly could have been an Israel of sorts of Northern Australia. Fascinating idea. Legal academic Ken Parrish has proposed another charter city in Northern Australia that could absorb potentially huge influxes of refugees, called Refuge City. Parrish proposes, rather than refugee resettlement in regional towns, refugees could be resettled in a new charter city created specifically for that purpose, sited on Melville Island on the north coast, off the north coast of Darwin. He proposes that the relative separation of the charter city from Darwin and other much more distant capitals will ease the community tensions and divisions sometimes associated with refugee resettlement. He says, if Australians are not so enthusiastic about sharing their good luck with refugees, a charter city administered by Australia could at least allow them access to the governmental and legal institutions in the form of this charter city, which have served Australia so well. Being a constitutional lawyer, he never really designed what it could look like, but in a Audric and School of Design studio, we had students build neighbourhoods for this hypothetical new refuge city, which could be a dense, vibrant and organic city that owes much to the building traditions of various home countries of the refugees' communities. And it could be a kind of mosaic of different neighbourhoods and communities rather than a monolithic block of urbanism. Given the most successful new city proposals in Australia are often capital cities, there's been various proposals for a new capital of the north, such as Australia's Northern Eco-City proposed by Ecoscape on the shores of Lake Argyll. Okay, thanks for hanging with me there. So that's the 8 scenarios. So now we're going to run them through community sentiment and see what people made of them. So again, a quick note to the maths. ABS projects an increase of 53 million by 2100. A population of 53 million by 2100, an increase of 28. We're only asking people, where should we put the remaining 14, given that half of them will probably disperse organically. Here are the scenarios, and I will now go through them in order. So the winning scenario was clearly satellite cities. It was regarded as livable, potentially sustainable and feasible. As one respondent said, yes, satellite cities are sensible and a practical approach to spreading population. So there was a lot of support for this. There was a feeling that people living in those satellites would be able to access the cultural amenity and jobs of the capital cities, but in a way that doesn't subsume and overwhelm the infrastructure of those cities. The second most popular scenario with our 1,000 respondents, which were community members from across Australia, was rail cities. So the idea of threading high-speed rail links between Brisbane and Melbourne and Gerald and maybe even Esperance on the West Coast and building new cities along high-speed rail links. As one respondent said, yes, the perfect model. Every state needs high-speed rail to link all its cities. It encourages the redistribution of people, wealth and energy across more land, instead of most of the state's resources being funneled directly into just one city. This scenario will increase the dynamic of the entire region. Unbelieving to me, and I wasn't even going to include this scenario because I thought it was so ridiculous. Nicole Edwards, and I'm grateful for this from our team, said this should be on there. Inland cities ranked 3rd in terms of community support, which was fascinating to me because it seems to run so counter to everything that we would think it would be sensible in this age of climate change. So this idea of developing Central Australia and moving inland continues to linger in the collective unconscious of Australians for one reason or another. As a respondent said, we have huge areas of uninhabited land, and populating some of these areas would solve the problem of having the coastal areas overpopulated. Australia's regional towns are sorely neglected and crying out for residents, while the cities are jam-packed. Ranking 4th, perhaps representing a kind of the wax-it mood of the time, was the WA cities scenario. As one respondent said, WA is the economic powerhouse of Australia. It makes sense to increase its population. 5th was northern cities, which I think was based on similar kind of ideas. 6th was the sea change cities, and this is where things started to turn pretty negative with the comments. As one person said, I sympathise with anyone who wants to live near the coast, but I'm appalled at the prospect of one endless Gold Coast development, which will destroy what we most value about our coastline. This reflects the problem of amenity migration, where we tend to be, we migrate to areas of high amenity in many cases, then trash that amenity. Certainly something that respondent feels personally. 7th was the boosting secondary capital cities like Perth and Adelaide. As one respondent said, why repeat the mistakes of the City of Melbourne? Overpopulation leads to congestion, an unaffordable housing market, loss of community unique character, risk or scarcity, and even crime. And finally, megacities, which was universally loathed. As one respondent said, megacities with a population of 7 million or more would be un-Australian and against all that Australia represents. And yuck, overcrowding, expensive property, people living in high rises, outlier ghetto suburbs, increasing crime, long commutes. Honestly, though, this is probably what will happen because the government seems incapable of planning ahead of its election cycle. And here we can see the overall scores, and you can see mega cities there, second from the top, really triggering people. But what we're really seeing here is substantial population, support for population decentralisation away from the capital cities, Melbourne and Sydney in particular. So we've been waiting for this tipping point that's been predicted for decades, at least from the 1970s, of this emphasis of shifting from the capitals to the regions. And certainly our results would seem to indicate that that tipping point has been achieved. And now some of you might just go, well, this is just national scale NIMBYism, that most of your respondents from the capital cities, and they just don't want growth in the capital. So of course they're saying, yeah, send it inland or send it to the north, anywhere where we're not. But actually we had a lot of respondents who are from regional areas who supported population growth in their hometowns. So this is significant. So it is not just, can't be explained just through national scale NIMBYism. The other thing I wanted to just show you here was from the survey. We had a question about why people did not support population growth in their hometown or city, for those who didn't. And I just wanted to say some of the main reasons they would resist increases in population were threats to the natural environment, decrease in green space, and growing traffic congestion. And then actually fourth was increasingly crowded public spaces. So the reason I bring it up with you guys is because as planners, these are fundamental to the work we do. And I think it speaks to the ability and the importance of our work in terms of maintaining support for population growth and immigration, and even support for the cohesion of Australian society. All of these things are are things that we have some control over in the urban environment, and such are very important. We did a similar survey with some more fine-grained scenarios that went to 284 planning experts through peer. Thank you for that again. I won't go into detail with that, but just to say there was a rare confluence of expert and community opinion. The experts also ranked satellite cities first. They ranked it as being potentially sustainable, livable, productive, and feasible. This is where things start to differ. They were much more supportive of boosted secondary capital cities like Perth and Adelaide, perhaps reflecting a greater faith in planning to deal with some of the issues that we confront. They were also on board, however, with visionary planning in the form of high-speed rail links in new cities. They weren't against just boosting all the capital cities, which is likely to just happen anyway if we do nothing. Felt ambivalent about sea change cities. We did also a scenario about southern mega regions, which was really kind of retreating to the south, which came seventh. Northern cities was not appreciated, was regarded as not a sensible option in this age of climate change in either form. Coastal megacities again were loathed, and for whatever reason, they really were quite triggered by this whole Western cities thing. Perhaps they're all from the East Coast, who knows? And here we can see the various scores for the different scenarios. So we listen to the people. We're not too far to go here, closing in on the end, but now we will listen to the land and really begin to consider each of these different scenarios in terms of what the landscape is telling us if we listen to it. There hasn't been many attempts to do this, to map the suitability of the Australian continent for urbanisation. It's only been attempted once before, prior to us, as far as we were aware, by Doug Cox, who was a CSIRO scientist. In the early 90s, in a fairly crude form, he produced a map showing areas which are most suitable for urbanisation, based on a variety of different factors I won't go into. It showed that there was a hotspot for suitability in Queensland, but most of the continent was fairly inopportune. So to take this to the next level, we fed a multitude of maps into the mapping machine. They were broadly in 4 categories, one relating to climate, one relating to the environment and cultural conditions, one related to existing infrastructure, and one to economics. In terms of climate, we fed into the mapping machine climate change mapping, which is fairly alarming for significantly increase in average summer heat, decreasing rainfall, and increasing incidence of extreme cyclones, not more cyclones, but more extreme ones. And these are really important because there's a reason to think under an RCP 8.5 projection that some areas of the inland and of Northern Australia will be simply uninhabitable. This is because of wet bulb temperature events, which is events where humidity is high and temperature is extreme, and the body can no longer cool down from evapotranspiration. It is predicted that there will be, by about 2070 in the Arabian Gulf, we will be having intermittent lethal wet bulb temperature events where even a fit person sitting in the shade outside cannot cool down because you cannot evapotranspire water, i.e. sweat water, to cool. And in that condition, they were saying that a fit person could be dead within 6 years, even 6 hours, sitting in the shade or under a tree. So these are really worrying things. And, you know, Buckminster Fuller's proposal for a dome over Manhattan may have indeed just been ahead of its time in terms of creating cities which are resilient to wet bulb temperature events. So what we did was then we ran these maps through the machine and weighted them to produce an overall climatic submodel analysis map, which shows from a climatic perspective areas which are most suitable, which typically is in the south. Tasmania is looking good, and least suitable, let's say where we have sort of wet bulb temperature of potential events, Kununurra as looking very bad from a climatic point of view. We then looked at natural and cultural heritage, the presumption being we cannot afford to continue to urbanise at the expense of biodiversity, and also in areas which have significant Indigenous cultural history and meaning, current meaning. So we considered native vegetation, biodiversity hotspots, conservation reserves, native determination areas, and hydrology to produce a map like this. This is surprising because it seems to show a whole bunch of areas which you wouldn't want to develop as being suitable. But do note the biodiversity hotspots around Sydney and Brisbane and Perth really looking not that suitable given their biodiversity constraints. We then looked at infrastructure. Of course, if we have to build another 9 Sydneys in the next 80 years, then that's going to require the duplication of a lot of infrastructure. We need to be doing that where we need to be trying to graft population onto where we have existing infrastructure for pragmatic regions, the NBN being one, water pipelines, power lines, airports, regional rail, major roads, and deep water ports. And when we overlay all those in the infrastructural submodel, we get a suitability map that looks like this. It more or less suggests the infrastructural capacity is generally where we have existing populations, and striking out into the wilderness is going to be exorbitantly expensive from an infrastructural point of view. Finally, and a development economist will just laugh at the superficiality of this one, but we looked at some economic factors like average household weekly income and proximity to capital cities where so many of the jobs are, and produce an economic sub-model kind of map, which really shows and I think highlights the economic opportunities offered by the capitals. So when you layer all these maps together and weight them accordingly, you get a composite map like this. And really, it kind of tells you what you intuitively would have known anyway, that the southeast and the southwest look like the best bet. Plenty of established infrastructure, jobs, reasonable climate. And if you're careful, you could hop over the most biodiverse areas. So this kind of confirms, I guess, existing planning to some degree. However, it runs markedly against planning in the form of the federal government's white paper for developing Northern Australia in particular. That is one thing which is not, I think, well represented in this particular map. So what does it mean for our scenarios? When you combine the results of the Plan My Australia community and expert surveys and then run the scenarios through the suitability mapping machine, there are 2 clear winners. And one is the satellite cities model, which the experts rightly believed is, I think, potentially sustainable, livable, productive, and feasible. So it's hard to go past this as an enduring model for population redistribution. This is a view of the satellite city scenario from an orbiting satellite in 2100, housing 53 million people in a manner as we as planners could potentially feel proud. And look, I'm highly biased here, but really the mapping and both the experts and the community seem to indicate that the rail city scenario has legs. I'm biased, but there's a sense that such visionary schemes entwining high-speed rail links with new cities or dramatically boosted regional cities could deliver a kind of new Australian dream of access to natural amenity, affordable land, but also access back to the capitals in the form of the high-speed rail link and the NBN and the cultural amenity that those cities offer. Could be a dream which we could graft onto this continent and could be resilient to many of the challenges we're going to experience in this century and beyond. Okay. So we're on the homeward slide here now, but what does this all mean for policy? So clearly population growth in Sydney and Melbourne, the scale proposed is deeply unpopular and is more than a bit on the nose. And I think those state governments, and the federal government could be considering whether we really do want to lurch into an Australian mega city kind of territory. I think we also should be considering, and I consider that the Albanese government should be putting the brakes on the white paper for developing Northern Australia, at least as it applies to its population growth agenda. Other dimensions of it are probably quite valid. Similarly, I think Albanese would be well served by looking to the 160 countries worldwide with national urban policies, which Australia currently doesn't have, or closer to political home, considering the Gough-Whitlam government's national scale planning for population growth in the early 1970s, which is pictured here. This was their growth centres program, nominating centres generally outside of the capitals for population growth to take pressure off the capitals. While Gough-Whitlam's intention to build 10 new Canberras by the turn of the century is probably a bit of a stretch, the overarching national scale planning embodied in the growth centres program, which is pictured, is exactly what is required in this century of climate change, surging humanitarian migration and neoliberal development. Instead, our current mode of planning across the nation is jurisdictionally fragmented and based on different timeframes. And this could spell major problems as our planning system is subjected to increased pressures. Indeed, not every state even has a state planning strategy. The ones that do is shown in green here, well done WA. But the result is a kind of patchwork quilt, as Pierre describes it. But I would consider it perhaps even more an annoying jigsaw with mismatched and missing pieces. So this kind of fragmented, temporally and geographically fragmented planning regime across the nation is unlikely to be able to withstand effectively the kind of pressures it will be subjected to in this century. And I think the Whitlam's government's growth centre program has been kind of ridiculed in the literature. And certainly it collapsed in a heap when Gough-Whitlam was dismissed. And there's many, many lessons to be learned from this period. And we've written about that in papers if you want to read it. But regardless, if Australia's population growth projections are borne out, Australia will again need to build new cities this century. And a national urban policy is the right tool to support such ambitions. But it's also about the spirit, I think, that Gough-Whitlam brought to this task. As he said, building cities is by far the most difficult, complex and majestic thing that people do. In this, we come nearest in scale to what God does in creating the stars and the hills and the forests. In the 21st century, Australians will need to become gods again, but perhaps only through necessity. But if we're going to become gods, we might as well be good at it. And you could be forgiven for thinking this is all a bit fanciful. In response, however, I'd say consider Sydney, a bustling global city of almost 5 million people, which is often ranked in the top 10 most livable cities in the planet, that began with convicts staggering out of the reeking ships and having a drunken night on the shores of Farm Cove. So their contributions laid with those of successive boat and plane people and the Indigenous people have produced apparently one of the most livable cities on the planet, or indeed 4 or 5 of them. So from these little things, big things grow. If you still feel a bit cynical, I would direct you quickly towards the Audric website, which features the results and entries of our new cities competition, Business is Unusual, which Pierre also generously supported. We had a school competition to envision new cities for school kids, and we asked them to send a postcard from their future selves in 2100 describing the city they lived in. And we loved the sheer scale of their optimism. Floating islands powered by waves and starlight, kangaroo towers, hypersonic trains, flying villas and boomerang buildings, biome preservation bubbles, cities alive with returning flora and fauna, Nike flyer shoes, floating houses, and forget walkable cities, how about swimmable cities? And one of the entrants here. And then finally, we had a tertiary student dimension of this, the Green Rail by Natalie Coynton and Bridget Foley, about creating green precincts around rail stations throughout Australia. Beautiful entry. It was about Port Nexus here by Jeremy Laveau, which was all about finally trying to find a form with which we can reconcile urban development with the complex ecology and fragile ecologies of this nation. A third winning entry, this time by Nur Roslin, which envisaged a kind of alternative to lifeless detention and offshore processing centres in the form of a charter city with its own governing system to represent the diverse needs of new migrants and represent their voices in decision making. So look, thanks again to all my co-researchers, Bill Grace, I would like to note as well, who hasn't been listed. Thank you to Pierre for your support. We've so enjoyed the collaboration. Thank you to Audric's funding partners, WAPC, DPLH, Development WA, and Department of Communities. Thank you for supporting us, and I hope this presentation hasn't given you cause for reconsideration. And finally, a little pitch. If this is of interest and you would like to study urban design from anywhere in Australia, please log on to audric.org. We teach online and in person, and you can attend from wherever you are. And we've got a 3-year, 4-year project now with all those funding partners to look at climate sensitive urban design. And we'd love to have you join us for that journey. Thank you.
Thanks, Jules. I think you've, well, according to Sharon Pope, you've entertained and informed us to such an extent that nobody else has got a question at this stage. So thanks, Sharon, for popping that in there. But I think it's certainly been a very informative presentation. We're just getting a few things through here now. Oh, great presentation, Julian. Awesome presentation. Wow, that was awesome. What is the proposed impact on agriculture? Let's go with that one first. That's from Julie Lee.
Thank you, Julie. What a great question. So Australia feeds about 50 million people per year. So hypothetically, we could almost feed this increased population projected by the ABS, but we then have to factor in climate change, which will reduce crop yields. We'll need to factor in that, you know, the Murray-Darling is in a state of palliative care, as is the wheat belt. We have to dump, you know, millions of tons of fertilizer onto those landscapes to make them productive. They are drying out. The wheat belt is contracting westward with climate change. We know the state of the Murray-Darling. So I think to continue to think that we can feed 50 million is probably a bit ambitious. That's going to come down. And there's big questions there. A lot of people start to talk about foreign ownership of farms, but actually we've lost much more farming land, not to foreign ownership of farms, but to just urban encroachment. So I think, you know, that is another reason that you would start to think that either decentralizing to areas which are not agriculturally productive or just doing compact cities is going to help. But real issues on that front, Julie, and thanks for raising it.
And following on from that, utilising renewable energy and desalination, what are your key reasons inland Australia could not be terraformed for agriculture?
Yeah.
3 miles.
Yeah, so that idea lingers, doesn't it, with the new tech that, you know, that we could do that. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, when you get Queensland elections and even Colin Barnett, you get all these wild pipeline schemes proposed. Some of you will remember Colin Barnett's proposal for a pipeline from the Kimberley, from Lake Argyle down to Perth, which is fine because water flows from north to south, so it would have been quite easy. But you know, I think there's real issues with those. The issue is how you would. There's the huge energy requirements in shifting water. And, you know, even the Southwest Integrated Scheme, which provides water to Perth, you know, there's vast emissions required to move that water around. But if it's connected to renewable energy, could you do it? Probably. But desal plants are exorbitantly expensive, and pipeline networks likewise. So you'd need a fairly good imperative to be developing the inland to pay for the cost of that infrastructure. And given the kind of infrastructure deficits we're already experiencing in the capitals, as they struggle to keep up with population growth, you do wonder a bit the degree to which we could fund such, you know, hugely expensive projects for watering the inland. But who knows? Maybe. Right.
Now, Larry Geyser's beaten me to a question I was going to ask you, so we'll deal with that deal with that altogether. The Audric research and others are presenting persuasive cases for change, but given most electorates, there's a political element, exist in the existing big cities, what will it take to convince politicians, business, and the wider community? Will fear of not changing or clearly articulating the benefits of new settlement patterns have the greatest impact? Yeah, well, it's a very astute question, and I think that goes to the core of the issue, doesn't it? I think part of the problem, right, is there's a kind of paralysis that comes with not having these discussions. Like, if we sleepwalk into this growth, change will occur anyway. And I think, I don't know. If I was a politician, this would be my narrative, is that this is going to change anyway. And you have two options, right? One is we all kind of bury our heads in the sand and we'll sleepwalk into this growth. And I think we can reliably predict that things will not end well.
under that scenario. The other is that we creatively engage with this growth. And I think part of the problem about population growth and it being politicized is that we haven't had many visions which have been produced, which could make people feel positive about it, which could incentivize people to support it and give them a reason to. And I think what I hope that this research at its best could possibly achieve is to create a kind of vision that could be picked up in a national urban policy, which would give people the feeling that we are dealing with this, we're planning for this, we have a vision. And I think you would find that if you had that planning in place, such as Peer is lobbying for, such as Audric is lobbying for, at the national scale, then I think you would find that the electorate would be more willing to consider greater population growth. It's the same at the urban scale. You need to be showing people that by accepting or even supporting densification, they get something back for it, which could be, better quality green space, improved streetscapes, improved cultural amenities. So I think, the planning is part of the tool for depoliticizing the whole issue of population growth. I think once the planning's in place, you could then have a real informed discussion with communities. But when they don't see, I think, the national scale planning in place, I think they're inclined to think that maybe it isn't really being planned for, and therefore, why would they support it?
Yeah, I think there's a reasonable proportion of the population that it's quite expects to be informed about what's going on and just wants to ask some questions and understand it. They're not necessarily that cohort that you would call a NIMBY. They just want to be better informed to make better understanding. Now, where are we at here? Statistics this week on world population say that we'll never have as many children under 5 as we currently do. Does the ageing world population have an impact on best settlement pattern? That's going from Sharon Pope.
Well, great question, Sharon. And certainly, yes, we just ticked over 8 billion, didn't we? And the UN projected it will go to 10 or 11 billion, I think it is, by the end of the century. And then decline. And a lot of that is due to cities. So people are moving to cities, urbanization is going on around the world, and typically they have less children in that setting. And it's also, particularly as women become more educated in developing countries, less children, population growth rates decrease. So I think that reaffirms that this creative opportunity that we have in this century actually likely won't be repeated on this scale. This is quite unprecedented, the moment we're in at the moment. And it will have huge implications, but how it relates to our scenarios, I'm not sure. I think, what we're finding in much finer neighborhood scale research is that aging populations are particularly interested in having downsizing opportunities, housing diversity, access to public transport. But all of those things are probably not well represented at this scale, but are very important when you come to neighborhood scale design. And certainly those needs are coming through very clearly in our Density My Way survey we ran recently, but it's a very good question.
There's a couple of other good questions. I'm trying to decide which one to ask you. Michael, not me, if you did the survey again, noting COVID-19, the bushfires last summer and the floods currently, would you think that the survey results would steer away from a regional focus and towards the existing cities as a popular choice?
Yeah, Michael, good question. Both surveys were conducted in 2020. So they were in the first kind of wave of the pandemic. And I think that irrigated support for the regional decentralization. So it does pick that up. We found that in these surveys, we had a couple of questions around the pandemic, and 40% of people said they were more inclined to live in a regional destination since the onset of the pandemic. Now, there might be a bit of that flow might be retracting back to the capitals a bit now, but I don't think it would dramatically change the results. The bushfires, the floods certainly would play into it. And I think, it's possible that schemes like the Rail Cities, which proposes, new cities through some of these very heavily forested kind of, larger regions, particularly in the southeast, could be a concern. But I think we're finding with climate change that all of these scenarios, are going to have their issues. Sea change cities is definitely going to have scenarios. The northern cities, well, I think potentially alarming scenarios. But even the megacity scenario, the urban heat island effect, the relative heat of the urban centre compared to the rural fringe, is likely to be enormous in an Australian megacity like Sydney. So all of them are going to have problems on those fronts. So I don't think it necessarily would change the overarching assessment, but a good question.
All right, we can put another one in, I reckon. Brisbane did a great, this is from Julie Brooke. Brisbane did a great gamification project that showed people that growth is a choice of competing interests. The messages need to include that we can't go on with business as usual, which is why you've coined the phrase business as unusual. What is your approach to this type of message? Business as unusual, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to consider when we engage with communities, we need to be honest about human nature, in that I think even the most entrenched NIMBY is likely to feel that population densification in capital cities is needed to some degree. I think we would all argue that we don't want Perth to sprawl to Geraldton. But that altruism for many people, not all people, for many people, tends to evaporate a bit when it comes down to your own domestic environment and your lived experience, because our mental and physical health is so related to our home environment, our sense of well-being, our sense of place, our sense of belonging. These residential environments are enormously complex in the way we perceive them and in the way they support us. And I think we need to recognise that up front when we engage with communities. This is their lives, and we're not just dealing with. And I slip into this mode of abstract population numbers, but these are real human beings with needs and wants and fears. And I think we need to be able to be open with them about that fact. But we need to be able to speak to them both at the altruistic level, which is that we can't afford a Perth that sprawls to Geraldton, for instance, but also that we are offering things. There's a trade-off here where they're getting things back for not just accepting density, but for supporting density, and that we will ensure that it's delivered in a way which is most reconciled, with what that suburb, with its existing kind of morphology, so that we can kind of creatively re-engage with that. Unfortunately, some of the examples of density that we're delivering around Australia have the opposite effect in local communities. And in those situations, it's hard to see why they would support density.
Yeah, and I think overwhelmingly, it's if you can make the case that density will give you something rather than take something away, so that the change is going to be something positive to enhance your life rather than take away what you're used to. So it seems that concern about community attitude and sort of our cultural preferences around the way we build our cities and where we live is a fairly dominant theme through here, and that's consistent with other work that we've been doing. So do you want to take one more question, Jules? And then, they're flowing through. You can take them for as long as you like. I think we should 10:30, but would the mega city be a more suitable scenario if we had lower levels of NIMBYism and could adequately develop inner and middle ring suburbs? How would you deal with character and heritage?
I think the megacity scenario would be hard to reconcile with NIMBY sentiment, would be my take. Particularly in Sydney, for instance, where you're constrained, unless you start terracing the Blue Mountains to the east, or developing the national park to the south. And we've seen how constrained the floodplains are in Sydney with the recent floods. I think the only way would be up, and I suspect you would only deliver a megacity in Sydney by pretty much steamrolling existing communities. So I struggle to see how that would happen. The suburban densities that are already kind of on the move anyway in Sydney would be long gone, I think, for that city to reach 10 million or more, which is mega city status. But wow, I'd love to see someone have a go at that and see whether how that could work and how that could look. One thing some of you will know, we've been promoting an idea called green space orientated development, which I note the Greater City Commission has also been pushing, and also their green grid. So the idea of densifying, but also kind of densifying, environmental spaces such as parks and green networks as a kind of compensatory mechanism. And so I think if you did push the Sydney to megacity status, you'd want to do it with those kind of green infrastructures in place to really support that population. So you densify the green infrastructure and the urbanism at the same time.
All right. Why don't we wrap up question time there? Thank you, everybody, for submitting your questions. I think that was a great way to complement Jules's presentation. Is there anything else, Jules, that we need to take away from this afternoon?
No, I think I've said my piece, so I'll say no more. But thanks for the opportunity, Michael.
Okay, thank you. And as we said, everybody, thank you for coming from all walks of life around Australia, and we will make this recording available. And Jules, your slides too can be provided, is that correct? That's great.
Absolutely, I'll flick them through.
Okay, that's wonderful. So there should be plenty of follow-up information.